My name is Alina Adams. I was born in Odessa, USSR. I wrote 2 books set in the Soviet Union. My daughter was born in America. I'm going to tell her about the Soviet experience through books. So for our last episode of 2024, the year is almost over. Can you believe that? Take a moment to go. For our last episode of 2024, we're actually going to be doing something a little bit different. I went to a book launch for Year 1 by Marina Radin, which is a book that we have reviewed, and you can see it right here on this channel. And it was held at this cute little store called MyBiblioteka in Brooklyn. And it was a store that had books in Russian, in Ukrainian, and English translated books from Russian and Ukrainian. So I thought we'd do something a little bit different, and I asked Anya to give us a little tour of her store and to show us some of the books that she has and to explain what kind of books you might want to get for your kids, for your parents, for your grandparents, and oh yeah, for yourself. So let's go back to your very early childhood. You're a little baby Aries, and I'm reading books to you, some of them which were in Russian. Do you remember anything that I read to you from when you were that little, like before the age of 5?
We had those really big Russian books.
Yeah, we did.
The yellow one about the kid who flies,
Yes.
right?
No, it was Carlson. She's remembering Carlson. He's not the kid who flies. He lives on the roof and he flies, and he has a kid into whose home he flies and causes all sorts of damage, which is actually very Cat in the Hat core now that I think about it. So if you have an interest in books that you can read to your child who's 5 and younger, here's what Anya recommends.
You could do good old fairy tales. For example, Fairy Tales by Suteyev. All the kids grew up on these. I'm sure all the parents right now will be recognizing these illustrations. His tales are mostly very kind, but they do definitely help explain some of the values and holidays, as well as some of the Soviet realities of celebrating things in school, of going out and being a team, of, community rather than individuality.
Now, as you got older and you started reading for yourself instead of having me read to you, you mostly read books in English. What do you think of kids who are in elementary school or middle school reading books that are in another language?
I mean, I had to read like packets and books in Hebrew at school, and it did not go great, I'm gonna be honest. It's very hard. Maybe just because Hebrew and English are like reverse reading, so it gets a little confusing. But it's hard, but sometimes it's like more fun to read something in its original language than to have it translated.
So here are your options for elementary and middle grade books in Russian and in Ukrainian.
I think for the youngest kids, I would highly recommend this new book. It's called Ya Korol, Little Stories. And it's a collection of short stories about kids encountering prejudice and racism in the USSR because of all of the national conflicts, because of all of the ethnic conflicts, and that were never really talked about, but people definitely lived through them, even as kids. For something a little lighter on the topic, perhaps they would enjoy «А Саша выйдет» Советское детство в историях и картинках. Is Sasha gonna come out? And it's these little anecdotes about young kids and school-aged kids going to school, going through buckwheat to pick out all of the dirt, walking up the stairs while wearing a mini skirt, picking up bubliki in a store, and getting candy in an airplane. So little anecdotes of Soviet life, more written in a nostalgic cue, that parents might want to share.
Now you're a big, mature, grown-up high school student, and you definitely choose your own reading material. But what kind of books do you think that high schoolers like to read in any language?
Romance and fantasy. Actually, I can't imagine fantasy in another language.
You can't fantasize about fantasy in another language?
It's more like in fantasy when they're doing world building, there's already so many made-up words. So I can't imagine people making up words based off of a different language, because they just put random English letters together and then that's the world, but I can't imagine it in another language.
So if your imagination is better than hers, here are some books for high school readers.
For your high school students, you can definitely read to them the book «Понаехали тут» or «Понаехавшие». Very, very similar titles, told very differently. «Понаехавшие» by Nirine Abgaryan is definitely more funny. But both tell the story of migrants coming to cities and the racism they experience, but also how it is to live as a child in a multiracial nation that hasn't really dealt with it, or how it feels to come as an Armenian to Moscow and try to find a job and survive there, but definitely with a lot more self-irony and sarcasm.
For me, the main reason that I pushed you and your brothers to learn Russian actually had very little to do with Russian literature and more to do with the fact that I wanted you to be able to speak to your grandparents. Now, your grandparents both speak English, but their true personality really comes through in Russian. So that was super important for me. And you have been able to communicate with them more or less as long as you're speaking to them in a Russian that has everyone's male and everything's in the present tense. And other than that, you can communicate with them. So this is something that I asked Anya, if we have English-speaking kids who want to buy a present for their Russian-speaking grandparents, what book does she recommend?
There's a beautiful book that I recommend that everybody have in their home library. It's called Ballad of a Small Tugboat, Баллада о маленьком буксире. It's the only poem by Joseph Brodsky that was published in the USSR. It's a children's poem. And it's been beautifully illustrated by Igor Aleynikov, who's probably one of the top illustrators today in Russia. And it's a story of a tugboat and its life, but it is also a story about immigration, or why would somebody not want to immigrate and leave their country, even though it's difficult. And it's a story of life and death. In the end, you know, the little tugboat, its life ends. It has illustrations of St. Petersburg that are absolutely gorgeous, that I think a lot of the grandparents and parents will recognize.
That's it for us for 2024. Please check out MyBiblioteka at their website. And remember, she has offered you lots and lots of tips for getting gifts for Hanukkah, Christmas, or New Year. You pick. Happy holidays.